As a counsellor and lecturer, I've heard hundreds of stories. One thing always stands out: how often people say, "I don't know what's real anymore." When the world sends mixed signals about identity, belonging, value, and truth, we lose our grounding. That's why this podcast exists. I'm Beverly at DDPCT, and this is The Signal Isn't Very Clear, a space to explore emotions, resilience, and recovery in a world that too often confuses us. We live surrounded by stories about who we are, what's true, and what matters. But sometimes those stories feel incomplete or distorted, even deliberately silenced. Sometimes the signal isn't very clear. By that, I don't mean simple confusion or a bit of misinformation. I'm talking about the very way we communicate, the way we share meaning, and how power decides which voices get heard. This isn't new. History is full of moments when information was controlled, distorted, or suppressed to serve particular interests. Consider Eric Berne, the founder of Transactional Analysis, TA, as many of you know. You might remember his model of the parent, adult, and child ego states, which helps us understand our internal dialogues and our relationships. But fewer people realize that his work emerged in a time thick with political tension, and that the political climate of the day cast a long shadow over his career. Back in the late 1940s and early 50s, during the height of the Red Scare in the United States, suspicion fell heavily on those who encouraged independent thought or questioned dominant narratives. Berne, like many others working in government institutions, was caught in that net. He came under scrutiny by federal investigators, lost his position with the Veterans Administration, and even had to surrender his passport temporarily. While he was eventually exonerated, the investigation left its mark, not least in the quiet reductions he made to his own work, where earlier references to political and social critique began to disappear. It wasn't a full-scale purge, but the message was unmistakable. Be careful what you say and whom you challenge. For Berne, the episode underscored how power could shape which voices were permitted and which were pushed aside. Public discourse during that time narrowed, and for a thinker so deeply concerned with open communication, that narrowing wasn't just personal, it was political. In other words, the signal was already being muddied. Fast forward to today. The forces Berne faced have evolved, but the core challenge remains. Information is still contested terrain. Social media platforms, mainstream news, governments, and interest groups all compete to shape public narratives. We see efforts to suppress certain voices and amplify others, often with political agendas lurking beneath the surface. When the signal isn't clear, it becomes harder to tell fact from fiction, harder to know whom to trust, even harder to believe that truth is possible. That uncertainty creates a climate of fear and division. Psychologically, people feel overwhelmed, anxious, or paralyzed. Our mental health suffers when the very systems we rely on for understanding seem fractured or untrustworthy. For psychology and counseling students, this matters deeply. It's not just theory, it touches the lived experiences of clients, communities, and professionals alike. But it's more than academic, it's a call to action. When the signal isn't clear, especially when powerful forces try to corrupt the flow of information, the work of understanding, questioning, and healing becomes more urgent than ever. Think of some of the issues we face right now. Social media platforms allow hate speech to flourish under the guise of free expression, silencing marginalized groups and fueling division. In parts of society, rights of LGBT plus individuals and others who fall outside narrow norms are being rolled back, with narratives shaped to exclude and demean. Politicians often choose the path of least resistance, following what is easy or popular rather than what is just and right, muddying public trust even further. Alarmingly, we see the rise of what many would call fascist ideologies here in the UK and around the world, threatening democratic processes. and our sense of community. Each of these struggles hinges on control of the signal, on who tells the story, whose voices are heard, and whose are ignored or erased. Understanding this matters not just for psychologists, but for anyone who cares about the kind of society we want to build. We'll explore these themes, and we'll examine psychological frameworks that help us tune out the noise. We'll look back at historical patterns like those experienced by Berne and see how they inform today's battles. And we'll reflect on how we can engage critically and compassionately to rebuild trust and clarity. But let me be clear. Clarity isn't a simple destination. Not about finding one uncontested truth or silencing opposing views. Clarity means holding complexity, tolerating uncertainty, and approaching conversations with humility and courage. It means really listening to voices different to our own, especially those that have been marginalized. So as we begin this journey, remember that the signal isn't very clear. That's our challenge, but also our reason to listen more carefully, to think more deeply and speak more courageously, because in that commitment lies the possibility of a clearer, more connected future. Before we explore Eric Berne's life and the political forces that try to silence him, let me introduce the psychological framework he created, transactional analysis, or TA. TA remains widely taught in psychology and counseling because it helps us see how we communicate with ourselves and with others, and how those conversations shape our relationships. At the center of TA is the PAC model, parent, adult, child. These are not literal people or stages of life, but ego states, distinct ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving that coexist within each other. The parent ego states carries the attitudes, rules, and values we have absorbed from authority figures and society. Sometimes this parent voice is nurturing, offering comfort and guidance. Other times it is critical, imposing harsh judgments. The adult represents the rational, objective part of us that processes information in the here and now, making decisions based on facts and reality. The child holds our feelings, impulses, creativity, and the memories of our early experiences, sometimes playful and spontaneous, sometimes fearful or defensive. These ego states are always interacting, both within ourselves and when we engage with others. Berne called these interactions transactions. When we communicate, the clarity and health of those transactions depend on which ego states are speaking and listening. Transactional analysis of communication, or TAC, builds on these ideas by examining how messages are sent, received, and interpreted. It looks at verbal and non-verbal cues, the surrounding social context, and the subtle power dynamics that color every exchange. These elements all influence how clear or how muddled our signal can be. Imagine a conversation where someone speaks from a critical parent ego state. That tone can shut down dialogue before it even begins, creating tension and fear. In contrast, a nurturing parent voice can encourage openness and trust, inviting honest sharing. When we engage from our adult state, we check the facts rather than reacting emotionally. We give ourselves the space to think, to weigh information, and to respond thoughtfully. When the child state comes forward, it may express genuine needs, creativity, and warmth, but if that child feels misunderstood or threatened, it can become defensive or reactive, leading to miscommunication. Berne used real-world examples to show how these dynamics play out. In families, old parent scripts can run on autopilot, repeating unchallenged expectations and judgments. In the workplace, power plays often masquerade as collaboration, obscuring true motives and creating conflicts that fester beneath the surface. Media messages can simplify or manipulate facts, while governments shape narratives to maintain control. Even social engineering efforts aim to influence public behavior by targeting specific ego states. exploiting our fears or desires to steer us in one direction or another. All of this illustrates a central theme. The signal isn't very clear. Communication is complex and layered, continually distorted by hidden agendas, emotional biases, and power imbalances. When we see the world through the lens of transactional analysis and the PAC model, we gain tools to look beneath the surface words. We begin to understand why misunderstandings happen, why conflicts escalate, and why some voices dominate while others remain unheard. This framework offers invaluable insight for anyone interested in better communication, especially those of us studying psychology or counseling. It reminds us that clarity doesn't come easily. It asks us to stay aware of which ego state we're operating from and listen for the voices that go unnoticed. In doing so, we move closer to conversations that are honest, respectful, and truly meaningful. You know, Eric Berne's work didn't appear out of nowhere. To really grasp his ideas and the impact they had, we need to imagine the world he was living in. He came of age in a time that felt like it was unraveling at the seams. The first half of the 20th century saw wars that spread across continents, totalitarian regimes everywhere tightened their grip, and then the Cold War casting its long shadow over everything. These were not gentle times. They were fraught with suspicion and fear, with people watching one another, wondering who might be plotting in dark corners. Berne's passion was grounded in a belief in people's potential, what he called autonomy, the chance for each of us to understand ourselves and relate to others in healthy ways. The PAC model, with the parent, adult, and child ego states, was his hopeful answer to the confusion he saw around him. Yet the hope sat uneasily with his awareness of the forces that could twist human connection into something ugly. Political repression, ideological conformity. These were not abstractions to him. He felt them keenly in his bones. He did not align himself with any political party or movement, but that did not protect him from suspicion. During the McCarthy era in the United States, simply questioning authority or emphasizing individual freedom could land you under a harsh spotlight. Berne's ideas, which encouraged people to question the scripts handed down by society and authority figures, were easily seen as dangerous. In a time when slogans like "better dead than red" or "kill a commie today" shaped public life, even encouraging empathy or critical thinking could be constituted as disloyal. Federal investigators cast their gaze on him, not for his theories directly, but in the paranoid search for communist affiliations that swept through government agency at the time. In truth, his so-called allegiances were more a product of the paranoia of the time than any clear political activism on his part. But the consequences were all too real. He faced professional disruption. He lost his government role and encountered an atmosphere where speaking freely could carry real risk. Colleagues began to self-censor, afraid of being labeled un-American or dangerous. The very notion of open discourse in psychology risked disappearing under the weight of fear. And so, many who practice transactional analysis today carry that caution with them, hesitating to wade into political waters because they inherited the memory of what happened to Berne, or some would say. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that Berne's work was political in its implications. By dissecting the ways in which powers show up in our everyday conversations, he was, in effect, giving us the tools to spot authority and resistance in both small interactions and larger social structures. Transactional analysis, at its heart, challenges rigid hierarchies. It champions dialogue, equality, and awareness, values that align so closely with democratic ideals. In that sense, Berne was sending an implicit critique to a society that so often prefers to silence dissent and enforce conformity. His life demonstrated how fragile open communication can be. We see now how easily political forces can twist or wipe out voices. turning psychological theories into battlegrounds for broader ideological structures. When we remember Berne's experience, we are reminded that the battle over communication is never just about words on a page. It's about power. It's about freedom, about the ongoing struggle to create a society that is more just and more transparent. So as we think about the work we do and the conversations we have, let's keep in mind the world Berne navigated. His story shows us both the risks of speaking truth to power and the necessity of doing so. In an age when the signal isn't always clear, it's a reminder that we must stay vigilant, that we must keep our minds and hearts open to voices that challenge the status quo. And in that challenge lies the hope for something clearer, something more honest, something that honors the potential in each of us to connect, to understand, and to change the world. Although Eric Berne developed his ideas more than 50 years ago, they still resonate with us today. The way we communicate, especially now that it's faster and more persuasive than ever, it carries with it complexity that can stun and overwhelm us. We live in an age where digital platforms promise to connect us, yet often distort our conversations and breed confusion. The theme Berne spoke of remains as true now as it was then. The signal isn't very clear. And when our signal is clouded, it can wound us as individuals and fracture our society. Think for a moment about how our interactions unfold in this digital era. We share thoughts in an instant, but that same speed can warp meaning. Social media, for all the voice it has amplified, voices that were once silenced, has also become a battlefield for competing narratives. Misinformation spreads like wildfire, and emotional manipulation becomes a tool in the hands of those who speak influence. Berne's model, with its parent, adult, and child ego states, still offers us a lens through which to see those tangled dynamics. When someone reacts from their child state to fear-driven content, their response can fan divisions and deepen conflicts. Yet when we engage from our adult state, thoughtful, balanced, and curious, we stand a better chance of navigating those turbulent waters. Berne also invited us to look at how power seeps into every exchange. Governments, corporations, and interest groups often tweak the signal to guide public opinion and behavior. Sometimes this takes the form of blunt propaganda, and other times it is a subtler framing that decides what we see and what remains hidden. If the signal is filtered through economic, political, or ideological lenses, the result is a version of reality that may serve some interests, but misleads so many more. There are consequences to living in such a world. When communication is unclear or manipulated, we feel anxious and mistrustful. We wonder who to believe and where to turn for solid ground. That uncertainty gnaws at our sense of security. We may feel powerless or isolated, and in that vulnerability, some of us can drift to extremes or conspiracy theories, simply because we crave clarity and control. In counseling rooms, this modern chaos comes through every day. Clients bring with them the noise of tweets, headlines, and deep dive videos that claim to reveal hidden truths. Their distress is often tangled up with their uncertainty about what is real. They wonder who is telling the truth, who is shaping the story, and whether they can trust anyone at all. Berne's transactional analysis gives counselors and clients a framework for teasing apart these layers of confusion. Together, they can explore how external noise awakens internal anxieties, how a tweet can trigger that old parent voice telling us to be afraid, or how a viral post can send our child state into a tailspin of emotion. But Berne's message goes beyond individual therapy. He challenges us to take up a collective responsibility. In a world of information overload and deep polarization, we must foster critical awareness and a sense of civic duty. We need to learn to read media with healthy skepticism, to invite open dialogue even when it feels risky, and to resist the lure of echo chambers that offer comfortable certainties rather than hard questions. His legacy also calls us to advocate for transparency and integrity in the systems that shape our lives, our news outlets, our political institutions, our workplaces. Having endured professional scrutiny and political suspicion, we are reminded that preserving spaces where diverse voices can speak openly is no small task. It demands vigilance and courage every day. Our challenge, then, is not only to decode the unclear signals around us, but help make them clearer for others. We must recognize that as much as we are receivers of messages, we are also senders. Every time we share something online, every conversation we have, we contribute to the collective signal, either clarifying it or adding to the noise. Berne's work remains profoundly relevant because it offers us both a mirror and a compass. It shows us how communication can be distorted by power, fear, and bias, and it suggests a way forward, healthier, more honest, and more empathic interactions in a world where, all too often, the signal is not very clear. You know, when our communication breaks down or becomes twisted, it's not just a matter of misunderstanding. It reaches deep into our mental health and the fabric of our social well-being. Eric Berne taught us how our interactions shape our inner worlds, and his insights remain vital as we navigate today's tangled communication landscape. Distorted communication happens when messages are manipulated or obscured, sometimes deliberately, leaving us feeling confused and mistrustful. In our modern society, this distortion is magnified by the torrent of information flowing through digital platforms, news media, and social networks. That constant noise can overwhelm us, making it harder and harder to tell fact from fiction, truth from propaganda, or genuine conversation from calculated rhetoric. One of the most common psychological consequences of this unclear signal is anxiety. When we cannot rely on the information we receive, or when we encounter conflicting narratives at every turn, a deep sense of uncertainty takes hold. That uncertainty triggers our stress responses and erodes our emotional resilience. We become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats. We find ourselves distrusting others and feeling vulnerable in ways that disrupt our daily lives. Another profound effect is socialization. If we cannot trust information around us or the people sharing it, we begin to pull away. We retreat into solitude or into insular communities that echo our own beliefs. Over time, this fragmentation weakens the bonds that allow for healthy dialogue and mutual understanding. Families, workplaces, and communities fracture under the weight of doubt and fear. Confusion is closely tied to those feelings, and it can be equally debilitating. When messages are contradictory or deliberately vague, we experience cognitive dissonance and mental fatigue. That confusion clouds our decision making and can lead to disengagement or apathy. We may feel powerless to change our circumstances, and, in extreme cases, that sense of powerlessness can push us towards conspiracy theories or extremist ideologies that offer simple, though harmful, explanations for complex realities. These psychological struggles are especially acute for vulnerable groups, people already living with mental health conditions, minority communities, or anyone facing social marginalization. Marginalized groups often see distorted or biased messaging that reinforces stigma and exclusion, deepening existing mental health inequalities. Our modern world of misinformation, hate speech, and social division feeds directly into these dynamics. Social media algorithms prioritize emotionally charged and divisive content because it drives engagement, regardless of truth or harm. This creates echo chambers that trap us in distorted signals and limit our exposure to different perspectives, closing doors to empathy and critical thinking. We also see political actors and interest groups exploiting these distortions to manipulate public opinion, silence dissent, and consolidate powers. Such tactics, such tactics deepen public distrust and polarize societies, weakening the democratic process that depend on open dialogue. For individuals, this climate of fear and suspicion can erode psychological well-being, leaving us helpless, cynical, and alone. As counselors and psychologists, we cannot ignore these impacts. Our clients often arrive in therapy weighed down by confusion, mistrust, and anxiety, all born of today's overwhelming, contradictory information flows. Transactional analysis offers a way forward by helping clients recognize how external noise triggers conflicts among their own ego states. We can guide them toward engaging from the adult state, grounded, reflective, and able to manage their emotional reactions. Beyond therapy, we must also foster media literacy, critical thinking, and emotional regulation skills. These are essential elements of mental health education and intervention. When individuals learn to evaluate information sources critically and to manage their emotional responses to distressing or manipulative content, they gain a measure of protection against the psychological harms of distorted communication. But the consequences of unclear signals extend far beyond individual distress. They fracture the social bonds upon which collective well-being and democratic participation rely. Berne reminded us that clear, honest, and empathic communication forms the bedrock not only of healthy relationships, but of a healthy society. Addressing the mental health fallout of these distorted signals requires action on many fronts, through therapy and education at the personal level and through advocacy for transparent, accountable communication systems at the societal level. Understanding these impacts is our challenge and also our opportunity. By recognizing how distorted messages affect our minds and our communities, we can chart a course toward clearer signals, stronger connections, and more resilient societies. In doing so, we honor the spirit of Berne's work and keep alive the hope for a world where communication heals rather than divides. When this signal isn't very clear, it's tempting to retreat, to wrap ourselves in cynicism, to fall silent, to detach. Yet Eric Berne never believed in stepping back. His life and work modeled a different path, one of engaged, thoughtful resistance to confusion, manipulation, and injustice. Berne understood that communication is never merely personal, it's deeply political. He knew what happens when someone speaks too clearly, when they refuse to bow to pressure or stay silent. He faced demands to conform. He kept quiet about ideas that challenged the status quo, but he resisted. He kept writing, kept teaching, kept refining the language of transactional analysis so the ordinary people could understand their own interactions and challenge unhealthy systems. He believed that by giving people tools to analyze how they spoke and listened, he could help them resist being shaped by rigid authority or hidden agendas. In Berne's view, every conversation, every exchange contributes to the tapestry of society. When we speak to one another, we choose which voices to give permission to, whose words we accept, whose values we perpetuate. If our public discourse is dominated by commanding, moralizing voices, or if it sinks into reactionary, fearful rants, then reasoned, balanced thinking becomes all the more vital. Berne urged us to cultivate that adult perspective, to speak and listen with empathy and reflection rather than defaulting to harsh judgments or knee-jerk defensiveness. He could not have predicted algorithmic amplification, clickbait headlines, or the speed of information warfare, yet the patterns he described endure. Today, miscommunication is not just interpersonal, it's woven into the very platforms we use. Politicians trigger emotional responses that push us back into our child state, where we lash out or recoil in fear. News outlets abandon balanced inquiry in favor of sensationalism, as though outrage were more valuable than understanding. And social media rewards content that ignites anger, drowning out the quieter voices that seek reasoned dialogue. These are the psychological scripts Berne warned us about, and they persist until we become conscious of them. So, what might civic responsibility look like through Berne's eyes? It begins with developing ego state awareness, not only as a therapeutic tool, but as a civic discipline. We must notice when we speak or listen from our adult, when we seek facts, consider context, and show empathy. We must be alert to moments when we slip into compliance out of fear or resort to reactionary anger. And we must learn to recognize when public figures adopt controlling voices simply to dominate or silence anyone who disagrees. At the same time, resisting everyday censorship and manipulation means more than fighting state-sponsored propaganda. It means acknowledging the quiet ways which we censor ourselves through peer pressure, through groupthink, through the filters of an algorithm that shows us only what it thinks will keep us hooked. When the signal is muddied, our task is not to shout louder, but to listen more carefully, to ask deeper questions of ourselves and those around us. Staying engaged is another vital lesson. It can feel easier, even comforting, to switch off, to shrug and say, it's too complicated, everyone's lying anyway. But that very withdrawal is a transaction with consequences. Passive silence cedes ground to those who benefit from our disengagement. It allows distortion to thrive unchecked. In transactional analysis, withdrawal itself is a script, a way of protecting ourselves that ultimately removes us from the conversation where we could make a difference. Berne also showed us that education is a political act. He wrote not just for specialists, but for anyone who wanted to understand themselves and their relationships. His commitment to accessible insight was a deliberate stance against the concentration of knowledge. Today, as psychologists, counselors, educators, or simply as citizens who care, we share that responsibility. We teach others to recognize hidden agendas, model clear communication, and empower people to question distortions whenever they appear. Finally, we must protect spaces where real dialogue can happen, whether in therapy rooms, classrooms, families, or community gatherings. Real conversation requires us to hold complexity, to tolerate discomfort, and to insist on respect. We must reject the dehumanization that so often precedes violence and refuse to believe that clarity is unattainable. Clarity is not the same as certainty. It's a commitment to honesty, to understanding, to empathy. Berne was never naive. He knew that people could be manipulated, that institutions could corrupt, yet he believed in growth, in the possibility of adult-to-adult communication, and the idea that the scripts we live by can be rewritten. As we navigate a time when the signal often seems obscured, let us remember that challenge is not merely technical, it is human. The solution lies not in more advanced algorithms or stricter regulations alone, but in better relationships, in conscious communication, and a renewed commitment to civic and psychological responsibility. Berne gave us a framework. How we use it is up to us. Eric Berne left behind more than just a psychological framework. He left us with an unfinished conversation, one that calls us to listen, respond, and act. His foundational ideas, particularly the parent-adult-child model and the concept of transactions, were never meant to be locked away in therapy rooms. From the beginning, Berne was pointed to something much bigger, how we relate to one another, how we understand the structures of our society, and how through communication we either uphold or challenge power. He also wrote lesser-known works that offer clues to his broader concerns. In 1963, he wrote The Structure and Dynamics of Organizations and Groups, applying transactional analysis principles to organizational life and believing that the dysfunctions of our systems mirror the patterns inside our minds between people. In 1970, he published Sex and Human Loving, taking an honest, demystified look at sexuality and certain our right to pleasure, autonomy, and authentic communication. While not overtly political, both works challenge prevailing norms, often progressive views on how systems and relationships shape our inner lives. In recent years, many of us have revisited Berne's political legacy with fresh urgency. One figure is Keith Tudor, who has critically examined the role of politics within transactional analysis, both historically and today. In his work on transactional analysis and politics, he highlights the ambivalence and at times outright resistance in our field to embracing its own political potential. Tudor reminds us that all communication, even the conversations we have in therapy, takes place within a social and political context. In recognition of this vital work, the International Transactional Analysis Association has named Keith Tudor the recipient of the 2025 Eric Berne Memorial Award. This award recognizes efforts to re-anchor transactional analysis in the real world, context of power, oppression, and liberation, honoring Berne's spirit whilst urging our field into a much-needed dialogue with the present. Why does this matter now? It's because, in many ways, this signal isn't very clear, and perhaps it never has been, unless we insist on clarity. Consider the challenges we face today: disinformation, marginalization, political propaganda, systemic inequality. These are not just social or political issues. They are psychological realities too. They shape our identities, increase trauma, distort relationships, and obscure meaning. These challenges show up in the therapy room and in the lives of people who come to us for help. If we ignore them or retreat into technical language and claims of apolitical neutrality, we would be failing our collective ethical responsibility. Berne's legacy demands more from us. It invites all of us, practitioners, students, concerned citizens, to see communication not just as a skill, but as a site of struggle. It reminds us that our adult ego state, often idealized as rational and balanced, must itself be courageous and critically informed. It reminds us that our child has a right to a voice, to joy, and even to rebellion. And it reminds us that our parent state should be questioned. Whose rules are we enforcing and whose voices are we echoing? And finally, it calls on us not to stay silent when the world drifts towards authoritarianism, false simplicity, and exclusion. As Keith Tudor writes, to be silent is to collude. We must make the signal clearer, not by shouting over one another, but by restoring depth, listening to history, and engage in relationships that honor truth, dignity, and our shared humanity. In closing, let me say this: clarity, political awareness, and compassion are not optional in our psychological work. They are foundational and essential to the world we are building together.